कैसे भाई कुछ पढ़ेंगे कुछ पढ़ेंगे मुख्तसर सा सलवार पढ़ने तो जाते
फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, वो हश्र के दिन की बख्शिश के सहारे होंगे, हश्र के दिन की बख्शिश के सहारे होंगे, तो कब्र में चैन से सोएंगे आज़ादारे हुसैन, कब्र में चैन से सोएंगे आज़ादारे हुसैन, आँख खोलेंगे तो कौसर के किनारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, वो काफिला खुल्द की जानिब जो बढ़ेगा अपना, काफिला खुल्द की जानिब जो बढ़ेगा अपना, राहबर हज़रत अब्बास हमारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, और अहले मातम को भला रोक सकेगा कोई, अहले मातम को भला रोक सकेगा कोई, बाबे जन्नत ज़हरा के दीदारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, और किन तमन्नाओं से 18 बरस ज़ैनब ने, किन तमन्नाओं से 18 बरस ज़ैनब ने, कितने सबके रुफ़े अकबर के पुकारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे, और इसको एक माँ ही समझ सकती है बाते अकबर, कैसे दिन सीस्त के लैला ने गुजारे होंगे, फर्द आमाल में बस अश्क हमारे होंगे।
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
Yeah, I think.
We only have 15 minutes now.
Yeah, I think so that will be using after. We just have like request, Moharrum. اللهم
صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: ثم قست قلوبكم من بعد ذلك فهي كالحجارة أو أشد قسوة وإن من الحجارة لما يتفجر منه الأنهار وإن منها لما يشقق فيخرج منه الماء وإن منها لما يهبط من خشية الله وما الله بغافل عما تعملون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
As I mentioned yesterday, what I'd like to do during these days that we have together is explore some of these verses in the Quran. I think there are two categories of verses in the Quran that typically are very challenging for people. One, like I mentioned yesterday, are these legal verses. The other is these amthal. And mathal or amthal is the plural of mathal, is used in the Quran for one of two meanings. One, I'm going to translate as similitudes. A similitude is something like a metaphor or a simile, where Allah is comparing one thing to another. Right? So He gives us some concept that says, life in the dunya is like this. And then He paints a picture of what it's like. Right? Or shirk and the worship of mushrikeen is like the web of a spider. Right? So He paints these pictures, these comparisons, to help us to try to understand something about that reality through some sort of a description of a worldly reality that we can probably be more familiar with. Something from nature that we see with our own eyes, we experience. And He's hoping that this can then be a bridge so we understand this thing and then we understand that other abstract or more difficult thing through the means of this simpler or more familiar thing. That's one meaning that these methods come in. The other is we have parables as well. So sometimes He tells us a story. He's not comparing two things, but He just tells us a story. Right? And through that story, we're supposed to understand certain lessons. Right? So both of those are there in the Quran, and they are sometimes challenging. While they're supposed to be stepping stones for us to understand something more complicated, sometimes the method itself is also challenging. And Allah Himself says, I'll read this verse to you, that it's only those who are alim, meaning those who have knowledge, who are able to understand these amthal, these parables and similitudes that He puts forth. They're not meant for, He's not dumbing something down and saying, let me give you something very simple that anyone can understand without even thinking about it. No, let me give you something that is something that you can understand more easily than that other concept, but you still have to have the prerequisites and you have to give it thought before you can access even the similitude. So He tells us in two places in the Quran what purpose He has set these similitudes out for. One is tafakkur and one is tadakkur. So He says in Surah Al-Hashr, وَتِلْكَ الْأَمْثَالُ نَضْرِبُهَا لِلنَّاسِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And so He puts these similitudes and parables forth for us so that we think about them. and tafakkur, we ponder over them, we think about them. They're not meant to just recite and be done with, or to peruse over very quickly and then never think about, but to ponder on. And it's only through pondering that we then start to understand. And it's the same in literature, right? The similes and metaphors and allegory and all that authors and poets also use, they're not easy, they're not simple. If the author is a complex writer, someone who has put thought into what he's writing, then the parables and the similes and metaphors are also going to be complex. And the more you ponder over them, the more reality becomes clear for you. And then if Allah is the one who's creating the similitude in the parable for us, then it's going to be a very, very complex and very accurate similitude. So the more we can ponder, the more meaning is going to become clear for us. So there's a one-to-one ratio between our level of tafakkur and the benefit that we're going to derive from this. But that's the purpose for which He's put these similitudes there for us, so that we do tafakkur. The other is tadakkur. وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالَ لِلنَّاسِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَذَكَّرُونَ. Tadakkur is calling to mind something, reminding yourself of something that you already knew. Right? To take heed of, if He tells you something and He gives you a parable and it inspires you and brings a new energy within you to follow or to believe or to learn something, that's a part of tadakkur. Or there's something you already knew. We know God is one, but then He gives us a similitude or something that makes it even more real for us. That how is shirk so evil, so bad? He tells us a story, it tells us a description that strikes home, and then we say that really is something terrible. Before I thought, of course it's obvious that God is one, shuraka are false, but now I have a renewed sort of faith in this principle. This is also tadakkur. Right? So it reminds us of something that we already knew, but now we need a reminder for it. So tafakkur is something probably new. We ponder, and through pondering we uncover meaning. Tadakkur is that we are reminding ourselves that we're now heeding something that we already had, but now we have renewed energy and inspiration to go forward. But He says in Surah Al-Ankabut, after mentioning that parable of the spider's web, which is one that we'll inshallah get to in the coming days, He says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَمْثَالِ نَضْرِبُهَا لِلنَّاسِ وَمَا يَعْقِلُهَا إِلَّا الْعَالِمُونَ. So He says that we put these parables, these similitudes forth for people. When He says لِلنَّاسِ in the Quran, He means for the common people, for everyone. Right? So it's not meant for the small group, it's meant for everyone. But He says nobody understands these parables except for the alim. Not alim in the sense of a formal position, alim in the sense of someone who has knowledge. So the prerequisite for understanding these parables that are there for everyone is that you have to have knowledge. Now, if everyone has knowledge, then everyone can access it. But if only a few people have knowledge and most people don't bother learning, then they're not going to be able to access these parables, even though they're meant for them. But they haven't done the prerequisites to qualify for understanding them. And one way to think about this is that there's this interplay mentioned in ahadith over and over again between our understanding and our aql and our knowledge. Right? They're two different things. They're two different faculties that we have. Our aql is the tool through which we learn, but understanding is not the same thing as knowledge. Understanding is what our aql does. It is also the tool by which we learn, but we use our aql to gain knowledge. We use our intellect to gain knowledge, to figure out what is knowledge, what is truth. And then once it's true, then to understand it. And then that becomes part of our repository of knowledge that our aql then has. Once it's empowered with additional knowledge, and now it has more power to look at new knowledge that's deeper or broader and acquire yet more knowledge. And then that also becomes part of its repository, and it grows. So that aql, that intellect, can then grow in strength, become stronger, more discerning, more able to process and to think and to lead us on the right path, to come to truth, which is its ultimate purpose. But the interplay is important. A good intellect with no knowledge, with no background, is going to be very weak. But if we use that intellect for good purpose, for learning, it becomes stronger and stronger, more and more experienced, more able to acquire more knowledge. So the more knowledge you have, the more power you have to acquire even more knowledge. But if you don't start the process, then you're left with just the raw material, the faculty, the talent that God gave you, but it's untapped. An untapped talent is pretty much useless. Right? So the prerequisite is there that we have to have ilm to understand them. Now the first of these amthal, these first of these similitudes I want to share with you is the one I mentioned in the beginning of the khutbah, and this is in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah mentions, he tells the story in Surah Al-Baqarah, generally he's telling the story of Bani Israel. Right? The Baqarah he's mentioning is the Baqarah that either could refer to the Baqarah that they started worshipping under Samiri, but more likely it's referring to the story of the murder that took place, and then they're trying to figure out who committed the murder, and Allah gives them this way of killing a cow and then striking part of the cow on the cow, and it comes to life, and all of these sorts of things. And then the person comes to life, and then he tells who the murderer is. So that's the general story behind the name of Baqarah. But the surah, the theme of the surah Baqarah is he's going through and mentioning all of these different blessings that he has given to the Bani Israel. Right? They still call themselves the chosen people. The Quran doesn't use the term chosen people, but it talks about the people who are mufaddal. Right? فَضَّلْنَاهُمْ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. Which means not that we chose them and selected them and now God's hands are tied, as they claim in the Quran, that his hands are tied. He chose us once, now he can't take it back. And now, even if he wants to, he's powerless. Right? The Quran says, خُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ. Allah's hands are not tied, their hands are tied. But he does talk about this tafdeel, these favors, these endless favors that he gave to them. And he recounts them in Surah Al-Baqarah. You can, just a quick list of some of them, the freeing of the Bani Israel who were enslaved by the Egyptians, freeing them from the Egyptians, allowing them through miraculous means to escape and then to go through the parted sea. The manna and quail, the free food that's bestowed on them every morning that they don't even have to work for. They don't have to plant, they don't have to buy, nothing. The food is there ready and available for them. The shelter that's given to them with clouds, right? So he lets clouds go over them to get them cool in the desert. Guide after guide, prophet after prophet. We're told in Ahadith that there are 400 prophets, 400 or 600, I'm forgetting the number, but 400 or 600 prophets between Israel himself, Yaqub, and Isa alayhi salam. Right? So that number of prophets coming one after the other to teach them, to emphasize the importance of worshiping God, to emphasize the covenant. And despite all of that, their response is constantly rebellion, ingratitude. We're not happy with this manna and quail, we're bored. Yeah. So ask your Lord to give us some onions and some lentils and some. They mention a whole laundry list of things. They give a grocery list and say, we want some of these things. Manna and quail is not good enough for us. And it even opens up the city for them. Jerusalem, it's occupied. But he says, if you march through, I will take care of the occupants and you will have free access to Jerusalem. Enter the door and say, Hitta, forgiveness for your sins, and the city is yours. And they say, we're not going. You, Moses, you and your God, you go through. We're going to sit here and wait and see what happens. And the result is 40 years, Allah says, if you're not going to do this, then for 40 years you're refugees. Wander in the desert. And during that time, they lose their prophet. They lose Moses. He dies. Finally, after 40 years, they are able to enter under the leadership of Joshua, Yusha ibn Nun. But they lost out on so much that they could have had because of their constant ingratitude and rebellion and all of this. This is the story of the Bani Israel in history. Then Surah Al-Baqarah links this to the Bani Israel who are there in Medina with the Prophet. He says, after all this happened, despite all of this blessing that I've given you, you Jews, he's talking to them in general. Your ancestors are talking to you now, but you're the same kind of people as your ancestors. You stand by whatever they stood for, so you're in the same category. So he says, you Bani Israel, you Jews of Medina, your hearts became hard despite all of that I gave you. ثم قست قلوبكم من بعد ذلك فهي كالحجارة أو أشد قسوة. your hearts are now as hard as rocks, rather harder still than rocks. Sometimes we say, you compare someone to something as an insult, and then you say, no, it's actually an insult to that thing. So in this case, your hearts are as hard as rocks, and Allah says, actually, it's an insult to rocks. Right? Because rather, your hearts are harder still than rock. To drive the point home, he says, look, rocks are not nearly as hard as you. He mentions 3 categories of rocks. And he shows how each of them is soft in some way. More pliant, more obedient, more, they do what they're supposed to do. فَهِيَ كَالْحِجَارَةِ أَوْ أَشَدُّ قَسْوَةً. Your hearts are hard as rocks, rather harder still. فَإِنَّ مِنَ الْحِجَارَةِ لَمَا يَتَفَجَّرُ مِنْهُ الْأَنْهَارُ. So he starts with, I think, the softest rock. The commentators are mixed, whether it goes in order of softest to hardest or hardest to softest, but I think the first is the softest. فَإِنَّ مِنَ الْحِجَارَةِ لَمَا يَتَفَجَّرُ مِنْهُ الْأَنْهَارُ. You have some rocks that are in and of themselves soft. We talk about them as almost like soluble. Think of like you go into these caves, caverns, and you have limestone, and the acidity of the water actually dissolves the rock, and the rock gives way. And you end up with all these beautiful formations of stalactites and stalagmites, but also holes going through where the water can then go through these underground rivers, right? Underground rivers and lakes that are there in these caves. So it seems to be describing something like this. That there's some rocks that are so soft, so soluble, so malleable, that the water can actually just make a hole right through it and flow right through. The rock gives way. وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَشَّقَّقُ فَيَخْرُجُ مِنْهُ الْمَاءُ. Some rock is not quite that soft. It's not soluble. It's hard, but when the water's pressure goes on it, the rock cracks. When the rock cracks, then the water can seep through. That's still softer than your hearts, because your hearts don't shift for anything. And thirdly, he says, وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَهْبِطُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ. He says the third category of rocks, these are hard. They're neither soluble like the first category, nor are they brittle where they crack. They stay solid regardless of what happens, but they're still softer than your hearts because they fall. An earthquake, erosion, landslide, whatever happens, these rocks from a height, they fall to the ground. In fear of God, in the awe of God, they fall. So the rock itself is not soft in any way, it doesn't even break, but it still obeys God and does exactly what it's told to do, exactly how it's designed to do. It reacts to gravity as Allah has designed it. It reacts to the motions that are acting on it, and when the motions dictate, then it falls according to God's plan, and does exactly as Allah wanted it to do. It's out of the fear of God, out of awe of Allah, khashya of Allah, that rock will fall. One question that arises is, why does he only mention khashya, min khashyatillah, for this third category? Was the first category of rock and the second category of rock also not with khashya? Did it also not have awe and fear of God? They all do. Right? So let me back up a little bit. Sometimes some of the commentators, they say that this is all metaphorical. Right? How can a rock have khashya? It doesn't even have consciousness. It's inanimate. Right? So rocks and mountains and earth and all these things, they don't have any sense, they don't have any intellect, they don't think, they don't feel. So whenever the Quran talks about them doing something like praising God or doing tasbih of Allah or obeying Allah, right? One verse says, our shadows in the morning and the evening, our shadows do sajda to Allah. Right? So they say that's figurative. Possible. That's one interpretation of it. These are figurative, right? That everything submits to Allah to such an extent that if these things if a rock had the ability to obey Allah, it would obey Allah. If it had the ability to fear God, it would fear God. If it could speak, it would do tasbih of Allah. That Allah is so worthy that even these inanimate objects, if it were just them and they had the ability to speak or to do sajda or do different things, they would do it. But you humans, despite the fact that you have such understanding, such intellect, such resources that have been given to you, right? You think you're so great, and you become so arrogant, and you argue with God rather than submitting to Him. But there's a really good case to be made for the fact that these, what we call inanimate objects, are actually very animate. Nothing in God's creation is without shu'ur, without a sense, without the ability to know and understand and worship Allah in the way that it knows how. Obey Allah in the way that it knows how. Follow the guidance of Allah as God has guided. Not at the same level as us, but in a way that's appropriate for itself. And the Quran is filled with this. The ahadith are even more filled with this kind of idea. And to say it's all figurative seems a little bit of a stretch. And one I think strong piece of evidence is shahada. Right? Shahada in the sense of testimony. So we're told that in what we call inanimate objects, even our body parts are going to do shahada against us. Hopefully not against us, but potentially against us. That my skin will testify against me. My feet, my arms, my tongue will testify against me. Right? And everything around us can testify. The earth will testify and say, yes, he did sajda on me. Yes, he prayed on me every day. My sajjada will testify for me and say, yes, he prayed every wajib prayer on me. Even the sky through which our good deeds are born upward, even that sky has consciousness of those good deeds coming through. So we have a hadith that say when an alim dies in particular, that even the sky through which his a'mal salihah, his good deeds would go up, even that sky warns for him and seeks forgiveness for him. He now misses those deeds that used to come up through the means of that sky and be born upward. So if something's going to do shahada and testify, it must have consciousness to be able to bear testimony, to be able to then deliver testimony. It should be able to bear witness itself. And even in legal circles, right? If somebody comes and tells us that there's a car wreck in front of the building, right? And then the police come and say we need eyewitnesses. Can any of us be eyewitnesses to that wreck? Even if the guy who comes and tells us, he tells us all the details, exactly what happened, exactly a play-by-play, recap of exactly what happened in the wreck. None of us who's sitting here, who can't see there, who are not present there, we cannot bear witness to what happened there. All we can say is secondhand, so-and-so told us that this happened. Maybe if we hear something, we can say, I heard something, but that's all we can do because that's all we have direct knowledge of. We can only testify to something when we are actually shahid, meaning present. Shahid, shahid means to be present. When you're present, then you can testify. And not only present physically, but you also have to be present in terms of your senses. Right? And so if on the day of judgment, Allah is going to call that sky, that earth, that tongue to come and testify to the deeds of people, it cannot testify by being coerced by the judge. Allah can't tell the tongue, say that he lied. And then the tongue says, yeah, he lied. And then that's somehow testimony against me that I lied. It must be that the tongue itself had a consciousness when I lied, it understood that I was lying. As it's participating in the lie, because it has to do whatever I tell it to do, my brain tells it to do. It participated in the lie, it has a consciousness of that lie that's recorded with it. In that consciousness that it has, then on the day of judgment, it makes sense for that tongue to testify and say, yes, I was there, unfortunately I was part of the lie that he told on such and such a day, and he said these particular words, and it was a lie. So that testimony, that shahada that these things give, only makes sense if they have consciousness to begin with. So I think that then gives us a door into thinking about these other things. When he says, "In min shay'in illa yusabbihu bihamdihi walakin la tafqahuna tasbihahum." Every single thing does tasbih of Allah, but we don't understand the tasbih. We don't hear it. You and I don't hear it. The Prophet did. Right? He tells us in certain places that when he comes down from Hira after receiving revelation, that every stone and every tree, everything he passed by was saying, "Assalamu alaykum ya Rasulullah." Was doing tasbih of Allah and saying Allahu Akbar. He could understand these things because he had less veils and less hindrance. We're too distracted and we don't have that sort of connection. That doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that we can't understand it. La tafqahuna tasbihah. We don't have fiqh. We don't have understanding of what the tasbih means. So when he says that this stone some stones, they fall in the khashya of Allah. We don't need to go to the level of saying, well, that's just figurative. If the stone could have khashya, it would have khashya. But rather, the stone does have khashya of Allah. To the extent that that stone knows God and knows its creator, it does exactly what its creator tells it to do. It's completely obedient, willingly obedient. But it's not just that third category of stone that has khashya, it's all three of them. Every creature of Allah, it's only humans and jinn who have the power to rebel against Allah. And even we only have partial power to rebel against Allah. My body cannot rebel against Allah. Right? I can't defy gravity. Gravity acts on my body, and my body must obey that law of Allah, and it must answer. The powers of health and sickness and all these different things that act on my body, I have no power. I can't say I choose not to be sick. I'm going to exercise my free will and say I'm not going to be sick today. It's not up to me. If the causes are there, then I'm going to be sick. Death, I can't say I'm going to wait a second. I'm not quite ready. Give me another week, and then I'll choose to die then. It's not up to me. I can choose in certain circumstances. Allah tells me pray. I can say no, I'm not going to pray. Fast. No, I'm not going to fast. Stay away from this haram. No, I'm going to do it. So I do have choices in certain limited areas. So I can't be rebellious in certain areas, but I can't be rebellious 100%. Everything else in creation, besides humans and jinn, have no free will. They do obey Allah. They do have fear of Allah. He guides them in whatever way is appropriate for them, tells them what to do, programs them, puts in the DNA, however his design is, but they know what to do. They know how to fulfill their purpose, and they do fulfill that purpose. So all of these stones and everything else in creation are doing what they do. They are obeying Allah, and that one lets the water go through, the other one cracks and lets water go through, and the other one falls from the mountaintop. They're all doing it out of khashya of Allah. Why does he mention khashya only for the third one? Possibly because the first two, they had some sort of internal sign of humility. The first one it dissolved. The second one cracked. Internally, it showed some subservience. The last one was hard. It stayed hard, but it did fall. And so Allah wants to remind us that when it falls, even though it's not changing internally, but even the falling that it's doing is in khashyatullah, out of the fear of God. So then he goes back, let's go back to the connection. So he's talking to the Bani Israel, despite all these things, your hearts have become hard. Harder, as hard as rocks, harder still. It's not fair to rocks to compare your hearts to them, because rocks are humble in these ways. They have the fear of Allah. Your hearts don't have any of that. Then the question for us, this is just the parable itself. I think we'll have to extend the rest of the discussion into tomorrow. But for a few minutes, I'll speak about this idea of qaswatul qalb. That's the whole message we're supposed to be getting out of this. What was it that made the hearts of the Bani Israel hard? What does it even mean for hearts to be hard? Are we in danger of this? And if we are already kind of victim to hardness of the heart, then what do we do? What's the remedy? So hardness of the heart, and the opposite would be riqqatul qalb. Qaswatul qalb is hardness, and riqqatul qalb. Riqqa means something like delicateness. In this case, softness of the heart. So it has two aspects. One is to be soft or hard with respect to truth, in submission to truth. So something's very clear for me. You argue something, you present the evidence, it's clear that it's right. If I submit to it and I say it makes perfect sense, everything looks like it's in order, I accept, it's true. That's a sign that I have a soft heart. When truth is clear for me, I accept it. Hardness would be being stubborn, being arrogant. Right? Sometimes you get into an argument and you had a position, you started with a position, now you start to realize that your position is not so strong. The other guy has the better position. But you stick to your guns anyway. You say, for the sake of my pride, or whatever the reason is, I'm gonna, even though I'm pretty sure I'm wrong, I'm certain I'm wrong, I'm sure he's right, but I'm gonna stick to my guns. That's a sign of hardness of the heart. If you're not submitting to the truth, when something becomes clear that it's true, then a soft-hearted person should accept it and say, that's true, so I accept it. Another aspect of hardness, the softness of the heart, is emotions. Right? So being soft means that you are affected by things. You see suffering and it affects you. You also feel empathy for that suffering, and you feel that I can understand what that person is going through. I can commiserate with them. I now that'll lead to me doing good things for them, maybe trying to alleviate that suffering, trying to compensate them, somehow doing something. But I'm affected by it. It's not that I pass by and say, "Oh, suffering, big deal." I've seen plenty of that, and you keep passing by, keep walking by, but it affects you. Yes, that's what good. And then the hardness of the heart would be the opposite of that. So that's something of what qaswatul qalb and riqqatul qalb means. Children oftentimes have this riqqatul qalb. So if you want to kind of see what it looks like, think of a young child. We call it naivete, and we kind of downplay it, say it's something they're naive. But actually, many aspects of that naivete is exactly what we should also be trying to maintain or recover from our youth. So a child is they're excited by things. They see something that's beautiful, amazing. They're amazed by it. Right? Then think of our time, our age as we increase. Sometimes you get into teenage years, and nothing can amaze you. Right? You're too cool for anything, and you can be the most amazing story, the most amazing thing, and you maintain this composure and dignity. It's actually just arrogance. That's not allowing you to give yourself over to the amazement that any human being would feel if they had a soft heart. That amazement that children have is something that's a part of softness of the heart. They're vulnerable. You tell them something, you explain something to them. If it makes sense to them at their level, then they believe it. Right? Their intellect and their faculties are not at the level where they can discern and tell, is it truly true or not. You can deceive them very easily. But the fact that as soon as they understand something, they hear their parents tell them something, their teacher tell them something, that's true. Right? So that kind of acceptance of what's told to you, that kind of affecting or being affected by things that happen, that's a good thing. Now it has to be tempered. There definitely has to be tempered with intellect, with wisdom, and that happens with age. So you're not affected by everything. You're not deceived by people and convinced that something's true when it's really not, because now you have the intellect to be able to sort through things and say, no, this doesn't make sense. You presented evidence, it seems to point to this, but I see the flaws here. Unless you can answer these questions, then I'm not going to accept. Right? So then you can push back some and you can debate, but as long as your heart is in the right place, you say, when I understand that something is true, I accept it. The only question mark is it established or not? Do I have any questions that are outstanding? But once the questions are dispelled or answered and the doubts are dispelled, then I submit. If that's our position, then that's one sign that our heart's in the right place. We have a soft heart. But if we find ourselves arrogant, fighting back, pushing back, sticking to our guns, regardless of the evidence against us, then that's a sign that we are on the wrong side of this, and we have hardened our heart. Recite the salawat. So I'll leave it there for today. There's still some things I want to talk about, some of those other questions I asked and I propose to answer. So inshallah, we'll continue that tomorrow when we have a little bit more time. Let us go to the story of Karbala. And I'll start the story in the month of Rajab in the year 60. And this is the date that we usually start on because this is when Muawiyah dies. Now, some years before, in the treaty between Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam and Muawiyah, one of the terms that they had come to agree upon was that Muawiyah, upon his death, would not appoint a successor. And even though he had broken many of the other terms of the treaty, because he had done it slyly and in a way that was not so obvious, Imam Hassan and then after his death, Imam Hussein kept up their end of the treaty and they maintained their position. But once Muawiyah once he died, he appointed his son Yazid as the Khalifa, now he had openly defied the treaty, openly broken the treaty. Now all bets were off. Muawiyah, in his savvy, he had made preparations, even though Yazid was not present when he died. But when Yazid finally came back from whatever frivolity he was on, when he came back and learned of his father's death, he was presented with a letter that he had written to his son, which told him that there are certain people who are going to be your major obstacles. You need to make sure to silence them or get them on your side immediately, otherwise they will cause trouble for you. And so he mentions that the three people are prominent people in Medina. One is Abdullah ibn Zubayr, one is Abdullah ibn Umar, and one is Al-Hussein ibn Ali. So Yazid quickly dispatches a messenger to Medina, to his governor, his cousin, Walid ibn Utbah ibn Abi Sufyan, his second cousin. Walid had recently replaced Marwan ibn al-Hakam, and they were on bad terms because of this. So Walid receives this message, and it instructs him that immediately you need to summon these three people, get their bay'ah, or threaten them. And at all costs, you have to take control of the situation, otherwise it's going to cause much trouble for the Khalifa. It's a late time in the day. Walid summons Marwan first to get his counsel, and begrudgingly, despite their differences, Marwan, when he sees an opportunity to have some influence, get something for himself, he comes and he advises him. He says, yeah, you have to do this. Go ahead, summon them immediately, and give them two choices, bay'ah or death. Even if it's coerced, that doesn't matter. That's nothing new for even Muawiyah. Coerced bay'ah, that's been standard for all these years. And so he immediately sends out a messenger to all three of them. Two of them are in the masjid. Abdullah bin Zubayr and Hussein are in the masjid of the Prophet. And the messenger comes and says that the governor is summoning you. They say, return, we'll come in our own time. Then the two of them discuss amongst themselves and say, what could this be? Abdullah bin Zubayr says, this is a very odd time for this kind of message to come. The governor doesn't usually, this is past business hours, doesn't usually see people at this time. What do you think it is? Imam Hussein, he knows the affairs, and he says, I think I know. I think Muawiyah has died, and Yazid has sent word that he needs our bay'ah. I think that's what this is about. Abdullah bin Zubayr, he avoids the situation altogether. He goes off to his family, and then he eventually flees in the night. Imam Hussein, alayhi salam, he goes home and he makes preparations for the encounter. He calls up the Banu Hashim, 18 of them answer his call. He says, I want you to arm yourself, and you're going to escort me to the governor's house. I have to speak to him. I don't think this conversation is going to go well. My signal to you is if I raise my voice, then you enter, and you help me to exit that place. If not, then you just remain where you are at the door. And so they go to the governor's palace. Imam Hussein enters, and he sees that Marwan and Walid ibn Utbah are both there. He asks what's happening. They read the letter from Yazid, and what Imam Hussein had guessed turns out to be true. Walid says that you need to give bay'ah to Yazid. Imam Hussein says, it's not appropriate for someone like me to give bay'ah at this time of the night in private. And what good is my bay'ah in this kind of atmosphere? You want my bay'ah in public so people see it, and then it influences the opinions of people, and then your matters will be in order. So let's not do it now, let's do it at a different time. Marwan sees Imam Hussein's response as a ploy, and he says to Walid ibn Utbah that if you let him go now, you're not going to get him back again. This is your opportunity. Give him the choice of either bay'ah or death. Now, Walid ibn Utbah was not willing to do this. He has a conscience, despite his lineage, despite the family he's from. At least at this level, he has a conscience. He says, I don't think that the one who kills Hussein will be in good standing on the Day of Judgment. I don't want to be that person. But Marwan, he insists, and he says that it's either death or bay'ah. And Imam Hussein raises his voice and says, how dare you threaten me with death? The likes of me does not give bay'ah to the likes of Yazid. When he raises his voice, the Banu Hashim enter, and they surround him, they escort him out, and deliver him safely to his home. A few days pass as Abdullah bin Zubayr flees the city. The forces of Walid are distracted, trying to pursue him. So for a day or two, they are out of the city, and Imam Hussein has a chance to arrange his affairs. He decides that he's going to leave Medina and go to Mecca. It's leading to Hajj time, and he says that he'll go to Mecca, and there he can relieve the situation here and then find another option there. He takes some counsel from his brother Muhammad ibn Hanafiya and so forth. At one stage, Imam Hussein ends up visiting his grandfather's grave to do a final ziyarah before he leaves Medina. He spends the night there. He has his conversations with his grandfather. At one point, before the time of morning, we're told that he falls asleep for a bit. And during that sleep, he is shown a vision of his grandfather, Rasulullah. And Rasulullah tells him that, my grandson, I see you lying in blood and sand on a land of karb and bala, a land of trial and tribulation. The people who will kill you are people from my ummah who imagine that despite killing you, or even because of killing you, they will achieve my intercession on the Day of Judgment. And Rasulullah prays and says, may Allah deprive them and never show them the intercession from me on the Day of Judgment. He tells him that your father and your mother and your brother Hassan are all eagerly waiting for you to join us. Imam Hussein says, I'm ready. Why do I have to wait? Take me now and let me join you now. But Rasulullah says that your time has not yet come. Allah has assigned for you stations in paradise that you cannot achieve except through your martyrdom. And you have this path ahead of you that you must struggle through. And when you struggle through that path and you achieve your martyrdom, then you will join us. And then on the Day of Judgment, I and your father, your brother Hassan, your uncle Ja'far, your great uncle Hamza, we will all together as martyrs enter into paradise, into the highest stations. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bi fidaik alayka minni salamullahi abadan ma baqit wa baqiya al-layl wan-nahar ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين.
اللهم صل على
محمد يا ولي
अज़ान कौन पढ़ा?
What is it, Azan?
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين